The mop bucket slipped from his hands and clattered across the drill hall, water spreading over the polished floor like a cold reflection no one wanted to see. 50 soldiers stood along the wall in loose formation, boots straight, eyes locked forward, bodies stiff with silence. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. The staff sergeant kept yelling, his voice sharp and careless, the kind that fills a room without earning it. He snatched the janitor's cap and tossed it aside, laughing as if humiliation was just another training tool. I stood near the back, arms crossed, dressed like a civilian but standing like I never stopped being a soldier. The air smelled of bleach and dust. The older man bent to retrieve the bucket, his hand shaking just enough to notice if you were looking. I told myself it was not my fight anymore. I told myself I had turned in my rank, my authority, my right to step in. Then the staff sergeant leaned closer and said something he could never take back. The room tightened. 50 soldiers heard it. I did too. And something I thought I had buried overseas woke up without asking permission. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I had been out of uniform for almost 3 years by then. My name is Rachel McAllister, former infantry squad leader, honorably discharged after my 3rd deployment. I was 34 years old, living just outside Cedar Ridge Training Annex in eastern Kentucky, swinging a hammer on construction sites during the week and helping run the base gym on weekends. The Army no longer signed my checks, but it still shaped how I stood, how I watched rooms, how I read people before they spoke. That morning, I was on post to meet a retired first sergeant named Calvin Rhodes. He had been one of my early mentors, the quiet kind who corrected you without raising his voice and never asked for credit when things went right. After retirement, he took a part-time janitor job on base, not because he needed the money, but because he missed the rhythm of military life. He liked hearing boots on concrete, liked watching young soldiers arrive unsure of themselves and slowly find their footing. The drill hall was hosting a reserve unit from a neighboring state. They were early in their cycle, loud in that nervous way, still learning when to speak and when to disappear into formation. The staff sergeant running them was younger than me, maybe late 20s, carrying authority like a borrowed weapon. Everything about him felt sharp, from his tone to the way he moved, like he was trying to prove something every second he had eyes on him. I noticed the tension before the shouting ever started. The way he corrected soldiers publicly instead of quietly. The way he spoke to Calvin like he was part of the equipment, not a man who had once worn the same uniform. I felt it tug at something in me, but I stayed where I was. I was a civilian now. No rank, no authority. No place in that chain of command. Still, that base lived in my bones. The smell of cleaning chemicals mixed with dust. The echo of boots in a wide room. The way power could turn cruel when no one thought it would be challenged. I had seen that kind of thing overseas. I had shut it down when I wore stripes. Standing there that day, I kept telling myself I was just passing through. But some lessons do not leave you when the uniform does. The warning signs were there long before the yelling began. The staff sergeant kept stopping the formation for things that did not matter. A sleeve half an inch too high. A bootlace not perfectly tucked. Every correction came louder than the one before it, like he was winding himself up. Calvin moved along the walls, slow and careful, doing his job the way he always did. Head down. Out of the way. Each time he passed, the staff sergeant threw out another remark, not quite shouted, just loud enough for a few soldiers to hear and carry it down the line. I watched the soldiers react without moving. Young privates locked their eyes forward, jaws tight, shoulders stiff. They were learning a lesson they would never forget, even if they did not yet have words for it. A few of them glanced in my direction, confused. They did not know who I was or why a woman in civilian clothes stood so steady in a space where everyone else was frozen. I felt that old pressure build in my chest, the sense that something was drifting toward a point of no return and no one wanted to be the one blamed for stopping it. Then Calvin's mop caught on a boot and the bucket tipped. Water spread across the floor with a hollow splash that echoed through the hall. The staff sergeant snapped. He closed the distance in 3 quick steps, voice rising, body tight with anger. The room went silent in that unnatural way that only happens when everyone knows a line has just been crossed. My shoulders tensed. My hands curled without me telling them to. I knew that silence. I had heard it before, right before things went wrong. He grabbed Calvin by the sleeve like he was correcting a recruit fresh off the bus. Not violent, not yet, but deliberate. The kind of grip meant to remind someone who held the room. He started talking about respect, about standards, about knowing your place. His voice carried, bouncing off the walls so every soldier could hear it. Calvin did not resist. He did not pull away. He just nodded slowly, eyes lowered, apologizing in a quiet voice that barely reached past his own chest. That only fed it. The staff sergeant let go and turned the moment into a performance. He paced in front of the formation, pointing back at Calvin as if he were an example on a whiteboard. He talked about discipline while breaking it, about leadership while showing none. Calvin stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, holding a mop like it was a shield that did not work anymore. I watched the soldiers struggle with themselves. You could see it in their faces if you knew how to look. They knew it was wrong. They also knew the rules they had been taught. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not break formation. Do not challenge authority. Intervening meant attention, paperwork, consequences they did not yet understand. Staying silent meant carrying the weight of it later. I remembered that exact feeling, standing in rooms just like this years ago, watching good people freeze because no one had ever told them what to do when authority crossed into cruelty. The staff sergeant started joking, first about age, about how time makes people slow, then about usefulness, about how some people age out of being relevant. His tone shifted, sharper, more personal. He said some people were only good for cleaning up after real soldiers. That word hung in the air. Real, as if service expired the moment you stopped carrying a rifle. That was when I noticed Calvin's hands. They were shaking now, not enough for anyone yelling to notice, but enough if you were paying attention. He tightened his grip on the handle, knuckles whitening, still saying nothing. I felt my chest go tight like a strap had been pulled too hard. I had buried moments like this overseas, times when dignity was stripped quietly, in front of witnesses who did nothing because doing something felt dangerous. The staff sergeant kept going. He leaned in close to Calvin, invading space that should have been protected. He lowered his voice, which somehow made it worse. Soldiers strained to hear, afraid of missing whatever came next. I could see a young private swallow hard. Another blink fast, fighting tears or anger, maybe both. I told myself again that this was not my chain anymore, that I did not wear rank, that I had no authority here. But leadership does not always come from stripes. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly where silence leads. I had seen what happened when no one stepped in. I had watched people carry that weight long after the room emptied. The staff sergeant laughed again, louder this time, like he wanted approval. None came. The silence pressed in from all sides. Calvin shifted his feet slightly, the smallest movement, like a man bracing against a wind no one else could feel. That was when I knew this was not going to end on its own. Moments like this never do. They either get corrected or they rot into something worse. My breathing slowed the way it always did when things sharpened. The room felt smaller. The noise faded around the edges. I was not thinking about pride or anger. I was thinking about responsibility, about the soldiers watching and learning what leadership looked like when no one stopped it. About an older man who had given decades of his life to service and was now being reduced to a joke in front of people young enough to be his grandchildren. The staff sergeant took another step toward him, words lined up and ready. That was when something settled in me. Heavy. Certain. I had carried it before. And I knew, just like I had known overseas, that if this went 1 inch further, the cost of staying quiet would be higher than whatever came next. I stepped forward before the decision fully formed in my head. There was no announcement, no raised voice. I said his rank once, calm and steady, the way you do when you want someone to pause without turning the room into a spectacle. The sound cut through the tension. He turned toward me, surprise flashing across his face before irritation settled in. He told me to step back. He told me civilians did not get a vote in how he ran his formation. I told him he was out of line. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him. I told him to let the man finish his job and move on. The room seemed to shrink. 50 soldiers held their breath at the same time, like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The staff sergeant smiled. It was the kind of smile you see right before someone overplays their hand. He mistook calm for weakness. He took a step closer, close enough that I could smell coffee and cheap cologne on his breath. His voice dropped, meant for me alone, but still loud enough for a few soldiers to catch. He said something about women like me, about how we always thought we knew better, about how I should remember my place. I felt something settle instead of flare. Not anger, not pride, clarity. The insult did not matter. What mattered was the assumption behind it. He had already decided who I was without asking. He had already dismissed anything I might be, anything I might have done. I had seen that look before. Overseas, in rooms where power was used to test how far it could go. He had no idea who he was standing in front of. He did not know where I had been or what I had carried. And more importantly, he had already decided none of it mattered. The soldiers were watching now, not just out of the corners of their eyes. They were watching the way a room changes when someone finally steps in. I could feel the weight of that moment pressing down. Whatever happened next would stay with them. It would teach them something, whether I meant it to or not. I took a slow breath and stayed where I was. I did not square up. I did not threaten. I simply did not move. That seemed to confuse him more than anything else. He leaned in again, invading space, trying to reclaim control through proximity. His shoulder brushed mine, not hard, but deliberate. That was when I knew this was no longer about words. Authority had already failed. Respect had already been discarded. What remained was a choice. I could step back and let the lesson finish writing itself. Or I could stop it where it stood, knowing exactly what it would cost me. I did not think about consequences in that second. I thought about Calvin shaking hands, about the soldiers who would carry this memory into every formation that followed, about the kind of leader they were being shown in real time. He opened his mouth to speak again, confidence already lining up behind his teeth. I shifted my weight without anyone noticing. The decision had been made, even if no one else in the room knew it yet. What happened next was quick, but it was not dramatic. There was no build-up, no shouting, no hesitation I could feel afterward. Years of training took over before my thoughts could catch up. When he shoved my shoulder, not hard but intentional, I shifted my weight and redirected him the way I had taught dozens of young soldiers during combatives back when I still wore a uniform. It was simple leverage, timing, balance, nothing more. He hit the floor hard enough to knock the breath out of him, a sharp sound tearing from his chest as his back met concrete. The echo rolled through the drill hall and bounced off the walls. For half a second, everything erupted. A gasp. A shout cut short, boots scraping as bodies reacted without knowing how. Then the noise collapsed into silence again, heavier than before. 50 soldiers stared, eyes wide, faces unreadable. No one moved. Calvin stood frozen near the wall, both hands still wrapped around the mop handle like he was afraid to let go. The staff sergeant lay on the floor, stunned more than injured, eyes locked on the ceiling as his lungs fought to catch up with him. I stepped back immediately. No follow-up, no posture. My hands stayed open and visible at my sides. My breathing was steady even though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I told him to stay down, my voice calm, almost quiet. Not a threat. Not in order. Just fact. The room stayed locked in place. No cheers. No approval. Just shock and realization settling in all at once. This was not a fight. It was a consequence. I knew exactly what this would cost me the moment he hit the ground. I knew there would be reports, statements, questions that did not have easy answers. I also knew I would not take it back. I had spent too many years teaching soldiers that control mattered more than anger, that strength without restraint was just noise. In that moment, standing there in civilian clothes, I realized those lessons had never really left me. I looked around the room once, not searching for validation, just making sure everyone was still where they needed to be. 50 soldiers would remember this for the rest of their careers. Not the takedown. The silence that followed. The way authority stopped working the moment it crossed into cruelty. I would pay for what I did. I accepted that without hesitation. But as I stood there, hands still open, heart slowing back into rhythm, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Given the same moment, the same room, the same choice, I would do it again without changing a single step. Base security arrived fast, the way they always do when something breaks the quiet on post. Boots came through the doors and controlled steps, radios low, eyes scanning the room before settling on the man still on the floor. The staff sergeant was helped up slowly, one guard on each side, his face tight with embarrassment more than pain. He avoided looking at the formation. Avoided looking at Calvin. Avoided looking at me. They separated everyone and started taking statements. Names were written down. Times were confirmed. I gave my identification without hesitation. When they asked who I was, I told them. When they asked what happened, I described it exactly as it had unfolded. No excuses, no justifications dressed up as explanations. Just facts. When they asked why I intervened, I said the truth. Because a line had been crossed, and silence would have made me complicit. Calvin stood off to the side at first, hands clasped in front of him, shoulders still hunched like he expected to be told to leave. One of the security officers asked if he wanted to say anything. There was a long pause. Then Calvin straightened, just a little. He talked about the comments. Not just that day, but the pattern, the way the staff sergeant spoke to him whenever no one seemed to be watching. The way it had escalated. He said he had seen this kind of behavior before in his career and thought retirement meant he would never have to stand in front of it again. His voice shook, but he did not stop. That mattered. One by one, a few soldiers spoke up, at first quietly. Then clear. They backed up what Calvin said. They described the corrections, the jokes, the way the room had changed. Their hands shook. Their eyes stayed forward, but they did not back down. That was the real turning point, not the moment the staff sergeant hit the floor. The truth being spoken out loud, in front of witnesses, with no shouting to drown it out. You could feel the weight of it settle in the room. Authority shifted, not through force, but through accountability. The staff sergeant's posture changed as he listened. His shoulders sagged. The confidence he had walked in with bled away, one statement at a time. This was no longer about a civilian stepping in. It was about a pattern that could not be ignored once it was named. When security finished, the formation was dismissed early. The soldiers filed out quietly, not talking, each one carrying something different with them. Calvin stood there a moment longer, then nodded once in my direction. It was small, but it meant more than any words. As I walked out of the drill hall, I felt the weight of what was coming settle onto my shoulders. Investigations do not move fast, and consequences rarely feel clean. But something had shifted in that room. Not because someone went down, but because people who had been silent decided not to be anymore. The aftermath settled in quietly, the way it always does after something loud ends without another sound. The visiting unit was dismissed early, marched out in silence instead of cadence. The staff sergeant was relieved of his duties pending review and escorted away without ceremony. No speeches, no dramatic conclusions. Just procedures moving forward like they always do. I was escorted off base as well. Not roughly, not kindly either. Just professionally. Someone told me I would be contacted once statements were reviewed. I nodded and walked out without argument. When I reached my truck, I sat there longer than I meant to, both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. My heart slowly settled back into a normal rhythm. The adrenaline drained away, leaving that familiar hollow calm that always comes after you cross a line you know you cannot uncross. Calvin found me before he left. He stood by the driver's side window, hat back in his hands, looking older than he had that morning. He thanked me quietly. I told him he did not owe me anything. We both understood it had never been about gratitude. It was about dignity. About not letting years of service be erased by someone who thought authority gave them permission to strip it away. That night, sleep came late. I kept seeing the faces in the formation, the way their eyes followed every movement, the way the room changed when silence finally broke. I thought about what they learned without anyone spelling it out for them. That leadership is not volume. That strength does not require humiliation. That correction can happen without cruelty. I thought about how easy it is to confuse rank with character, and how dangerous that confusion can be when no one challenges it. Power does not need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it just needs to be stopped. I also thought about the cost, about the calls that would come, about explanations I would have to give to people who were not in that room. Consequences never land evenly, and I knew mine were still ahead of me. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the quiet of a house far from any base, one thing stayed clear. The soldiers who watched that day would carry that moment with them longer than any paperwork ever could. They would remember how quickly authority collapsed when it forgot its responsibility. And maybe, someday, when they stood in charge of a room of their own, they would choose differently because of it. I do not tell this story because I am proud of putting someone on the floor. That part was never the point. I tell it because of the silence that came before it and the voices that finally broke it. Military service teaches discipline, but it also teaches responsibility. Not just to follow orders, but to protect the people standing in front of you when authority starts to drift into something it was never meant to be. Being a veteran does not end the day the uniform comes off. The instincts stay. The awareness stays. The line between right and wrong does not fade just because your rank is gone. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to step back and let the system work. Other times, the harder choice is knowing when you cannot step back without becoming part of the problem. That day in the drill hall did not turn me into a hero. It reminded me who I already was, long before I stood there in civilian clothes. And it reminded 50 soldiers watching in silence that respect cannot be forced through fear. It cannot be shouted into existence. It is earned through restraint, accountability, and example. I do not know where those soldiers are now or what paths they took after that day, but I know moments like that stay with you. They surface years later when you are in charge, when someone weaker is standing in front of you, when the easy choice is to stay quiet. If this story stays with you, then it did what it needed to do. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.